Good day to everyone. We're really excited to have you here. I am Scott Brooks, Director of Research at the Global Sport Institute here at Arizona State University. And first, we'd like to recognize that the land where we are hosting this conversation in Arizona belongs to the Maricopa and Pima peoples, right? And so we want to make sure that we honor the Native folks here and pay the right kind of respect to them. This is their land. So just a little bit extra housekeeping for you. Here we are doing a Global Sport Matters live event today, and we've got another one coming up. Our next show is May 29th. We have experts who are going to talk about issues that are impacting the world of sport. And we invite all of you all to also pay attention to an event that we've got going on next Friday, and that's COVID-19 and sport in Latin America. We encourage you all to share information in the chat box and on social using the hashtags. Hashtag Global Sport Matters, and also follow us on @Global Sport Matters. So the reason we're here today is to talk about Ahmaud Arbery. He was an athlete, former football player, son, a runner, and an unarmed 25-year-old Black man who was gunned down on February 23rd, almost 3 months ago to the day. It took a viral video surfacing in early May, 2 months after his shooting, an outrage from social media for Ahmaud and his family, and all of this was needed to get some justice going. We've also seen outrage from professional athletes who called for a federal investigation, and the Justice Department seemed to need that in order to comply. On May 7th, 74 days after Ahmaud's death, the father and son killers were arrested, right? And they have now both been charged. Just yesterday, May 21st, the GBI, right? So that's the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, arrested William Roddy Bryan Jr., who filmed the video. And today, this is breaking news, today he was charged with felony murder and criminal attempt to commit false imprisonment, right? So we want to now, we know that this is not the first Black life taken, but in this moment, what is the reset that we need? How do we achieve it? And in today's conversation, we're talking with experts on sport, race, activism, folks who are able to tell us about the history of Blacks in citizenship and Blacks in sports. We're really happy to also have an athlete, a running athlete, here to talk to us and give us her perspective. So I want to welcome now our first guest, Mirna Valerio, who is a marathoner, an ultra marathon runner. That's even hard to say. She's an author, a teacher, a blogger, an advocate. She's been on the cover of various running magazines. She's endorsed as an athlete. She's not able to race right now, but we're so happy to have you with us here, Mirna. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really, really awesome. Not the occasion, obviously, but to be in community with you all is always a wonderful opportunity. So thank you.
And next, we also have Dr. Rashawn Ray. And Dr. Rashawn Ray is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Maryland. He's also a current fellow at the Brookings Institute. He also leads a research institute. And so thank you for being with us today, Rashawn.
Thank you for having me. I mean, as Mirna was saying, this is a great event. You all do great events, and I'm fortunate to be part of this one. And obviously, we're talking about an unfortunate incident, but hopefully we could talk about ways to move forward.
Yeah, we absolutely will. So I want to get right into it and ask a question I'm going to ask each panelist, and then one that we'll also ask the audience. So, I'll start with you, Mirna. Do folks of color run in your community?
I had to do some research on this because I live in one of the whitest states in the United States, in Vermont. And I live in the capital city, which is really just a small town. And we are 1.93% of the population.
Wow.
And given the percentages that I've heard thrown around by different folks about how many Black people actually do run, I would say it's probably way less than that. I'm probably the 1% that runs, along with my son and the other Black guy that I've seen on the bike path last week, actually, for the first time. So not a whole lot. A lot of, this is a very running filled and running friendly community, but not a lot of Black folk are out running that I can see.
Okay. And why don't, I want to give the audience a feel of your running career. So tell us when you started to run seriously and then when you turned pro.
Pro, I love that word. Well, I actually started running in high school as a way to get better at field hockey and lacrosse. And then I ran throughout college recreationally and throughout my early adulthood. And then in 2008, I had a health scare, which inspired me to get back on the wagon after a 3.5-year absence. And then as I sort of got back to my running self, I started a blog called Fat Girl Running, which I don't write in anymore, but it's still up, it's archived. And I somehow a couple of years later got recognized by the Wall Street Journal for the content of my blog, because I was writing about being a Black woman, being a fat Black woman in endurance sports spaces, because I'd loved marathoning. I loved ultra marathoning. That's where my heart lies. And I think my body is built for it, because I can just go on and on and on and on. So that's, and then after that, I got a lot of recognition and some notoriety from different media outlets. And so, and I started getting noticed by companies. So I'm very happily sponsored by a lot of major companies. That's actually why I'm able to just kind of live and have an apartment right now, because otherwise I would not have a place to live or food. So thank you to all the companies that sponsor me. And yeah, that's how I got to where I am in a nutshell. Okay, no, that's great. I wanted folks to hear more about you. Make sure you go and look up, Mirna's story. She's got a lot of different places where she's writing. They're doing videos on her. You got to go and check it out to learn more. She's an author as well. Make sure you read what it is that she's written. I wanna ask you about how different is it to run in a marathon versus running in your community, right? So as we get a little closer to Ahmad's case, how do those differ for you? Well, I mean, obviously in a marathon, you are running with lots of other people. Say you're running the New York City Marathon or the Boston Marathon, which I've both run. There are lots of different people from everywhere, lots of body sizes, lots of ethnicities, lots of abilities everywhere. Whereas in the community that I live in, and I've always lived pretty much my entire life, except for the beginning of my life, in predominantly white neighborhoods. And so it's a very different thing. When I would come home from school, from boarding school, and run in my neighborhood was mostly actually Puerto Rican and Italian. It was going more towards Puerto Ricans as I got older, but it used to be all Italian. And if I ran in it, like I was the only Black person running. There weren't a lot of people running out anyway, because I wasn't part of that culture in Brooklyn. Now it is. But there, and even now it's very different. I train alone. I prefer to train alone anyway. And, people see me out there all the time and they're like, wow, girl, you're out here again. Wow. And this happens to be a very sort of friendly state. That a state that is, even though there are not a lot of Black people here, it is a friendlier place than other places that I've lived in before.
Okay. Yeah. All right, so Rashawn, now I want to bring you in to talk a little bit more about this running in the neighborhoods, right? So you produced this wonderful article that really asks the question or says whether or not Black people are running in neighborhoods. Tell us a little bit about that research.
Yeah, so essentially what I did was I conducted a qualitative and a quantitative study. So the quantitative part I'll get to, but the qualitative work set the tone and in a lot of ways highlighted what Mirna was talking about. So I selected neighborhoods around the country that had predominantly Black, predominantly white, and racially integrated neighborhoods. And then they also varied by socioeconomic status. So some were more affluent, some were less affluent. And some of these places people will be familiar with. So Oakland, California, Rancho Cucamonga, California, and Southern California, Forest Park, Ohio, Brentwood, Tennessee, which is essentially a suburb of Nashville, and then Bowie, Maryland. And so I chose them for all different reasons based on their racial composition. And what I noticed is that people were laying claims on public spaces at times when they could be sharing those spaces. And I noticed the way that certain people laid claims on those spaces that led to other people being removed from those spaces. So I took that work, and then I did a large quantitative study, well, large in the sense that I had 500 middle-class Blacks and whites. And as you know, it's difficult to get that particular sample of Blacks. And what I was interested in is a series of things, but one in particular was the role that racial composition played in physical activity. What I found was that Black men in predominantly white neighborhoods were significantly less likely to engage in physical activity, whereas white men, white women, as well as Black women were more likely to engage in physical activity in predominantly white neighborhoods. And so as it relates to Ahmaud, the key finding here is that Black men felt and experienced an overt form of criminalization in predominantly white spaces, where their Blackness and their Black skin became weaponized and actually reduced their propensity to engage in physical activity.
Wow. Yeah, right. So when you hear this, what we love about this, of course, is the intersectionality. For me, on the qualitative side, it's automatically a legitimate study because you got my hometown, Oakland, in there, right? So repping Oakland. But
right.
It's fascinating to talk about how it varies when you look at gender and race. And so, Mirna, how does that resonate with you? What does safety look like for you as a runner? Are these concerns that you have?
They are actually concerns that I have, not necessarily about myself, because I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman, and I am definitely not seen as the threat that Black men are seen as. But I do worry about my son. My son is 17 years old. He's very tall. He's dark skinned, very handsome. Thank you. And he likes to run. And I'll just give you a really quick example of how he prefers running here in Vermont at night, because he doesn't have to look at anybody, and he doesn't have to talk to any of the overly curious people that are here. But when we were in Utah a couple of weeks ago at a running retreat that I was co-hosting, he refused to go run outside, because every time he went outside, people would stare at him. And it was such an uncomfortable stare that it made him not want to be outside at all. And I think that's what Dr. Ray is talking about, as far as people taking those spaces for themselves and locking other people out. It might not even be overt. It might just be this sort of implicit understanding that you are not to be in the space at all, because you don't belong. And so I don't worry about myself. And I've definitely had encounters where people have called the cops on me while I was running on my own street in Georgia. But nothing other than the cops coming and rolling by slowly happened. But if my son was out there, if he had been out there running that day, maybe something different would have happened. So that's what I worry about in terms of safety.
Yeah, it's the interaction that occurs, right? These gestures when you're running and you see a person, I'm thinking of whether it raises your heart rate, but the stress, the additional thinking, that you need to employ as you strategize. How is this person perceiving me? I've joked around and said that social distancing is what I've lived every day, right? So as a 6'4" Black man, when I walk in public, there's social distancing that is already happening. The difference is people seem to be a little bit nicer because they're going through it now as well. So Rashawn, tell us if is there something, your next project, I'm pushing on you more research, and I know we always have additional projects, but I'm wondering if you're going to look, whether that's at other race ethnicities or whether you're going to dig into the actual interpersonal. What's next with your research on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I've definitely dug into the interpersonal part. So I think it's a couple things going on. First, you mentioned Oakland. As you know, I mean, there are drastic differences in Oakland between, say, Lake Merritt, which is actually one of the more ideal places to be. Of course, outside of Black people getting called the police on for trying to just grill, which is what everybody does at Lake Merritt. But Lake Merritt is one of the only 2% of census tracts in the United States that has a similar percentage of Asians, whites, Blacks, and Latinos that also have a similar level of education and income. Only 2% of census tracts exist like that. That's one of the reasons why we actually lived there when I was doing my postdoc with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation when I was working at Berkeley, is to actually experience that particular neighborhood. That was drastically different from East Oakland, which is where my wife was working as a healthcare provider. And so part of what my work highlights is also the ways, as you just mentioned about stress, that running is supposed to be an activity that should extend life. But when it comes to Black people, we might actually see that activity might actually reduce life because people might be less likely to do it because they're criminalized. And what I found is that Black men go through a signaling process where they try to signal that they belong. They do things like, and this is partly because they understand the stereotypes that exist about them, right? So they're trying to diffuse those stereotypes, not to necessarily just make people feel more comfortable, but to actually survive daily encounters. So they do things like wear an alumni t-shirt, run in well-lit areas, wave and smile at neighbors, run in places with more people. Like, who does that? Like, when you're a runner, nobody does those kind of things. That makes running more difficult oftentimes. Well, you probably do because you're Black, right? And so we have these types of dynamics where when we are in predominantly white neighborhoods, these are coping mechanisms and survival responses. The problem, though, is that they have long-term health implications for our stress, our level of anxiety, as well as depression.
You know, Marta, you look like you had something you wanted to add. Go ahead.
I do the same signaling too. I wear all the latest running gear so people know I'm a runner and I'm actually out running because that's what I'm doing. I have my hat, I wave, I smile. I am overly friendly, and I'm not the friendliest person when I'm outside. I'm from New York, come on. But I've got a big old smile and hey, just so people will feel more comfortable around me.
Yeah.
Everything you just said, Dr. Ray, is hitting home. Every single thing.
Yeah, I've got my sons behind me, and they've been amening it as they've been listening to both of you speak as young Black men, and Mirna's son, and as well as Rashawn's comments. It's athletic code switching, if you will, recreational code switching, right? Where we're trying to present ourselves in ways that allow us to cross over. So we're going to take a poll, and we're going to come back with our next set of guests. We will see you all in just a moment, right? Thank you for this first segment. It gives us a lot to bite off. Appreciate you. We'll see you in just a little bit.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And for our first poll, one of the things that obviously Ahmad's case brings up is how do we engage? How do we create change? There was obviously social media was a big piece of this case. And so what we want to know from you all is, what ways do you engage with most to create change? So I'm going to go ahead and plug this so the panelists can vote too. We've got a number of answers. It's multiple choice, but let us know, how do you engage to create change? So this is pretty remarkable. Many of us use a number of forms of ways to engage to create change. Obviously, the one that was highest was voting, which is pretty remarkable and great to hear. And the other top choices: sharing social media and use of hashtags, donating to organizations, volunteering. So really showing up and voting. So thinking about those that are making the decisions, and how do you make sure that it reflects our communities across the nation. So one of the questions that we actually had from the audience, and I'd love to get Mirna's perspective here. One of our questions comes from Stanley. Stanley says, saw the organization of protests against such anti-Black racism in the death of Arbery. I saw so many amazing African-American women on the protest lines, yet we have little coverage of Black women in running, other than highlighting only African runners. How are Black women erased from running and the nation? What are the politics of citizenship you experience as a runner because of your race, your shape, your body, comportment, and your class? Big questions.
Do we have an hour? I do want to say that, you know, running is a microcosm of all of our societal ills. So, and goodness. I want to say goodness because running has brought me so much. But, you know, it really is just a smaller space where the larger things that happen to us in larger society happen. So, you know, as a fat woman, as a Black woman, I remember early on before anyone knew who I was or what I was doing, there was always a sense of not belonging there. You know when it happens to you, you know when people stop talking, when you know what's happening, when there's a certain look. That's very difficult to qualify or quantify. There's a certain tone, there's a certain vibe. And so I can tell that when that vibe happens immediately, and it was in a lot of spaces, it was especially in the trail running space, you know, people were just surprised to see me there. And it showed on their faces, oh, well, okay, wow. Are you new to running? And so, you know, I think as a Black female, as a Black woman, our bodies are erased everywhere. Our bodies are not appreciated. They were appreciated for the work and the babies that they gave forth to the world. Many times unwillingly and forcefully, but you know, you don't see today. Yeah, every now and then you will see a Black woman grace the cover of a sports magazine or any kind of magazine. I was reading Elaine Welteroth's book. She used to be the Teen Vogue, the editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue. And she was the one that spearheaded the whole the fact that the current Teen Vogue was woke. So she spearheaded the wokeness of Teen Vogue. And she'd mentioned that there was the convention was, and it wasn't just an implicit convention, it was explicitly stated that you can't put a Black person on the front of a magazine, or a fat person, and there was some other undesirable body that would never make the magazine any money. And not particularly her magazine, but just in that industry. And that was not surprising to me. Right. It was not surprising. So yeah, there is a lot of that in all industries, in running now. Like, who do you see represented as a runner? Again, there are the, you know, the sort of essentialized bodies of running, or the people who are super elite and super fast from East Africa. But you don't really see anybody else. And so I know when I was on the cover, I wasn't on the cover of Runner's World, but I was featured in a 12-page feature. That's a lot of pages. Yep. And that, the amount of awful commentary I got on my body, was traumatic. But you know, that commentary on my body is rooted in white supremacy. You know, and I actually have the book right here. This is a great resource. It's called Fearing the Black Body by Dr.
Yeah, with the Hottentot Venus right on top.
Yes, here we go. It is an excellent resource as far as the history of the hatred of Black bodies, specifically Black women, goes. And so yeah, there's a lot that goes into that. Advertising and marketing is getting a little bit better. And so people are not as surprised. And I have the advantage of, you know, having been in magazines and having been in Wall Street Journal and having been on TV. So people are like, oh yeah, you're the running one. Right. So it's really tough to see that, you know, we are not represented proportionally in the numbers that we participate in things, especially in the big races. So that was a very long.
You're fine. We really appreciate you giving that. We're going to get right back to you.
Yeah. Okay.
So thank you for answering that question. And thank you, Stanley, sure, for asking it. So now we're going to turn to our next two guests. We have Dr. Lois Moore, who is an associate professor of history at Grand Valley State University. And we have Dr. Lois Brown, Foundation Professor of English and Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy here at Arizona State University. Thank you both. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here. Thanks so much.
So I'm going to start with the straightforward question. Do Black folks run in your community? And I will start with Lois.
So given that temperatures are going up in Arizona, that's one thing that tells us that people aren't going to be out at high noon. But I will say that Arizona has one of the highest numbers of gated communities in the United States. So thinking about how and where people run generally and how and where people of color and African Americans run is also really organized by the ways in which you don't have access, free access to community, as it were. So the numbers of African-American runners in my neighborhood is really constrained, A, by the number of African-Americans who are inside this community, the ones who are on the outside of the community, and the ways in which space is so politicized and policed in a way, just by virtue of the construction of community. So the answer is sadly very few and close to none.
Okay. How about for you, Louis?
Yeah, I'll just kind of reiterate what others have said. It's not a lot. Even myself, I barely run, and part of it is just I'm old and my body hurts every time I run. But the other part of it is, as Rashawn was saying, it's just what you have to go to run, what you have to think. Like, you know, running through my neighborhood, it's like, am I staring at this person's house too much, right? I don't want them to think that I'm casing their house or something like that. So it's something I'd rather avoid. But the other thing about Grand Rapids, so I'm in Grand Rapids, Michigan, it's just a very segregated city. And so even when you go through those pockets of segregation, you just don't see people out generally jogging, or people of color jogging. There's runners groups. Every runner group I've ever seen was pretty much all white. So yeah, so not a whole lot of jogging.
All right, and so I was really excited to have the two of you together for this segment because I wanted to be able to talk historically as well as contemporarily, right, about, you know, Blacks in citizenship as it pertains to sports and this event, right? You know, so particularly with your background, Louis, I want to talk a little bit about sport and citizenship. And then Lois, with your background, I want to talk about, you know, citizenship historically, but this translation of Ahmaud Arbery's situation and Breonna Taylor. So this whole thing about Black lives. So I'll start with you, Louis. You know, in your book, and I love this in the introduction, I got to read just a little bit of your book, but in the book, I Fight for a Living, you dropped this pearl for us. And it really, for me, I've talked about sport for mobility. It's one of these classic debates, but I had thoughts of it, but you really have the source information about it. So you spoke about some athletes, some Black athletes in the 1800s, early 1900s, but this pursuing sport and this question of why they would do it. Some were doing it, and they said it was for the fit for citizenship, right? This fit for citizenship. Can you share with us what that means? And then how do you think fit for citizenship applies for today's athletes?
Right, that's a really good question. So the idea of fit for citizenship, I got it when I was writing this article about Black gymnasium owners in antebellum America. So there's a few in Boston. There was one in Baltimore. He moved to Boston, but you know, they don't have citizenship, but they own these gyms. And the idea is that they're doing these things and they're putting themselves out there. One via physical culture, which is very popular in the mid 19th century, right? The other is through ownership. And so they're saying the mastery of my body and also my economic success should prove that I deserve these rights. And so from the beginning, when sports become pretty popular in America, right around the mid 19th century, you have Black folks involved and Black men and women involved in sports as a way to position themselves for better treatment. We could also see this if we move forward and say like the 1930s with Jackie or with Joe Louis or Jesse Owens, or in the 40s with Jackie Robinson, or the 50s with Althea Gibson, how the athletic success for not just these athletes, but for majority of Black community, when you look at these people, say, look, you're going to celebrate them, then you could celebrate me too, right? Then you could be comfortable with me in this space. And so much about sports within the Black community around that time was looking at these barrier breakers. I talk about it in the book, We Will Win the Day. It's about civil rights movements in sports and just how you celebrate barrier breakers. But what we know is that on this question of fit for citizenship, sports, and democracy, that's why you have the revolt of the Black athletes. That eventually what all these athletes knew, but what we see in the late 60s is these athletes finally say, you know what? It doesn't matter how successful I am. It doesn't matter what sport I do. You're still going to treat me like I'm not a full citizenship, right? A full citizen. And that's what we see in this case with Ahmaud, right? Where he's just jogging, something that if we all talked about would prove somehow that you fit in, right? It's a very middle-class thing to do. And yet on that day, at that moment, there were 3 people right now, that's all we know about, who said, no, you don't have this right. That's not part of your citizenship. And so that's where we're at. And I think that's where we've been at since the late 60s, where Black athletes have said, you know what, this is not part of the bargain. And so I'm going to stand up and say something.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, Lois, I'm happy that to talk about my love for Harlem Renaissance literature for just a second. And that's really Ways of White Folks. Langston Hughes' book is one of my favorite all-time books. It's one that I use in class often because it's so great at highlighting that color line. It's the supplement to Souls of Black Folks, Du Bois's book. And the short story format is amazing. And I know you're an expert on this, looking at Black literature, Harlem Renaissance literature, and these short stories. In a tragic way, I see the stories of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor as they could go into a Langston Hughes short story that would tell us about this color line, right? How do you tie these tragedies with Black history tragedies? So whether it's thinking of the Black lynching that went on, but what about this Black life and tragedies? How do these measure up, and what can we take from the history?
So it's a really sobering to watch and to even survive watching that video. And I just want to acknowledge the trauma of having to see it and thinking about all the young people who are seeing yet another vigilante event. And that this is not, we should never allow this to be normalized in that sense, that these are not just, it's not just another video. And in saying that, it's so important to contextualize the violence visited upon this young man in the larger context of the violence that explains the arrival, that frames the very arrival of Africans on the land of what becomes America, right? So the negotiation of land and Blackness is at the heart of American history, right? And as we see individuals like Anthony Johnson in Virginia making his way through indenture, enslavement, to becoming a free man with property. And then you read the awful tragic history of how that land was taken away from him and his descendants, right? How Black people occupy, own space, take pride in space. Really, American history is about repeated dispossession. So thinking about who gets removed from spaces, who gets policed in spaces, is really something that we see in being visited upon generation after generation. It comes through in language, in the literature that you're talking about. We can't help but think about Du Bois and his conversations about the color line. We can't help but think about Paul Laurence Dunbar and the mask we wear, and we would multiply that, make it plural. We wear many masks. I think Mirna and Rashawn have talked about that. It's exhausting, but it is absolutely at the core of what it has meant to be of African descent in America.
It's great. I didn't know that we would start talking about land so much. I'm an urban sociologist, so it makes sense. But to hear, you talking about land here, Rashawn has talked about land. You've got Mirna who's talking about where she lives and how it is varied. Lois, you use I think I saw it more than once. You talk about Major Taylor, right? So here we have this bicyclist who is fantastic, becomes world renowned, and yet we get back to this land issue. What's the land issue with Major Taylor that you often refer to?
So I think you're talking about, I have this thing called Story Map where you can map out stuff, and I put it publicly. So for listeners, if you go to like Knight's Lab with a K and put in Story Map and then put in Black athletes in housing, one of the things that comes up is that there's all these Black athletes, famous Black athletes, from Major Taylor to Jack Johnson to Jackie Robinson, Willie Mays, just trying to buy houses and getting shut down, dealing with discrimination. I ended with LeBron, the final series. I think they lose to the Warriors, but getting the inward scrolled on his house. It's just a walkthrough throughout America of all these successful athletes, right? People who are celebrated as beacons of democracy, and what they have to go through when they choose to leave a space where American says you have to be here. But also just on Taylor in general, if there's a book that came out last year, if you read it, we talk about being in spaces. Running and jogging are these things that really give you jogging and biking give you so much freedom, right? Other sports are pretty confined to where you can play, but you could you're supposed to jog anywhere you want, bike where you want. And anytime Taylor went out biking, he was always up against something, right? There's a lot of racism in there. In jogging, there's a lot of, I tweeted out last week, if you had a Black boxer in your community, you had a Black person jogging through your community, navigating racism. And then I pointed to an 1891 article of George Dixon, who's the champion of the world, getting stopped while he was running, being harassed and fighting these white guys in Boston. So there's this issue of space and mobility, even with top athletes, that they have to navigate.
So, Lois, I'm thinking of Harlem and its storied past for us. Do you expect that Harlem in the 20s and the 30s would have been a good place, would have been an okay place for Blacks to run? How does this change when we get to different parts of America? But I want to focus on the Northeast, where both of you have actually done a lot of research, right? There's so many strong roots to Black history in that Northeast. But how would Harlem Renaissance, during that time period, how would Blacks fare in terms of this leisure activity and whatnot?
So I think one of the really sobering things that comes out of this is that leisure for African Americans is really something that has not yet been fully realized across the population, across the demographic. Everyone on the panel has talked about the hyper performativity that goes along with breathing, going to the market, running, just working. It's constant vigilance, performativity, and the kind of response that we have. So in thinking about Harlem of the 1920s, 30s, Langston Hughes left America, right? Why did he leave? Because in some ways, the ways in which he negotiated places that were imagined as safe Black spaces like Harlem were also policed by the segregationist principles that were in place. We have an audience member watching now who's asked a question about sundown towns. So to come back to the conversation about place, there are so few places where you see writers of color, of the Harlem Renaissance, activists, artists. They are constantly navigating really hostile spaces that exact a toll on them, ask them to pay multiple admission fees to do what they're good at, what they're called to do, what they excel at, what they are truly gifted in ways that they're gifted. You can think about all of the exiles. James Baldwin, he goes to Europe to be free, of all places, of racism, just to distance himself from that. I would also say that coming back to place, thinking about where these tragedies of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery happened, Georgia and Kentucky, right? Again, it matters where these things happen. Thinking about Georgia, its connection to the history of enslavement. We tend to forget that Georgia was the only colony of the 13 original ones that didn't begin with enslavement. It didn't begin, it was not on the books for them. And it wasn't until it was advocated by a really famous minister named George Whitefield that it became part of Georgia's history, right? Kentucky, Louisville. That was the departure point. It was the portal to hell for so many enslaved people who were going to be exported to the Deep South. So thinking about, you're asking about the Harlem Renaissance, and in some ways I keep thinking about the concentric circles, the ripple effect, if you will, because what we know about You know, I was thinking in thinking about this panel, thinking about the case, when we think about enslavement, think about the Fugitive Slave Act, right? Think about the numbers of African enslaved people who ran. That's a whole different way to think about race and running and the way it exists in our national imagination. So in some ways, that is the thing that foretells, that predicts, it overlays everything we're living through now in the 21st century about how Black bodies are constantly on the run, have always been on the run, and that the state has empowered certain individuals, vigilantes, you know, guns for hire, slave catchers, you know, thinking about the ways in which they have infiltrated communities and reminded people whether or not they were free, whether or not they were self-emancipated, and brought them back into the hell of enslavement. We see it around the Great Migration. We see it around, you know, enslavement, Great Migration. We see it in the Harlem Renaissance pieces. All, you know, place and race are just so inextricably bound up with each other, and in such difficult and really, really sad ways.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, and it's a great segue to our next piece, our next session. So hold on there. We're going to bring in, we're going to do a poll first, and Kendall will talk to everyone about that poll, and then we'll bring everybody back out. Really appreciate y'all, especially that the last bit, Lois, you really gave us something. Is on the run. We're going to ask everyone about whether or not there are folks of color running in their neighborhood. And then we've also got another polling question. So Kendall, you ready?
Thanks, Scott, and thank you to both of our panelists in segment 2. So yeah, gonna go ahead and launch this poll. We actually have 2 of them in this section. So the first one that I'm launching, just as Scott pointed out, do folks of color run in your neighborhood? And just want to say we've had some great engagement in the Q&A, and just of note, one of our attendees was mentioning that the panelists, of course, are talking about all these fabulous, you know, places to read and to learn more about this topic. So if our panelists want to drop any of that in the chat, please do, and we'll be sure to try and capture as much as we can and send that out in the recap email to you all too. All right, so this first poll here, we'll keep it open for just a couple seconds more. Get your votes in. Okay, so for folks running of color running in your neighborhood, do folks of color run in your neighborhood? A little bit more overwhelmingly, yes, 53%, but no at 41%. And I don't know, which kind of talks about visibility. You know, thinking about when you yourself are out, or you know, how do you engage in exercise? So that's definitely interesting to see that 6% aren't really sure.
Yeah, you know what, Kendall, you know, when you think of Dr. Rashawn Ray's research, we should be asking a question of what's your neighborhood composition? We know now too, right?
Absolutely.
And then think about gender, would it be helpful? So we can get neighborhood composition, the intersectionality, what races and ethnicities, you know, are composed in your neighborhood, and then looking at that gender piece. Yeah, that's interesting stuff. You've got one more for us, right?
I do. So this one, so we won't queue it up. We're going to be talking about this in the next segment, but we just want to know, are you familiar with the phrase white comfort? And definitely keep those questions coming in the Q&A. Our panelists have been answering in the Q&A there too. So definitely appreciate all of the continuous engagement that we're seeing here. All right. Couple more seconds, get those final votes in. What do you think, Scott? Are you familiar with the phrase white comfort? Okay. 54% no, and 46% yes.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I remember first seeing the phrase just a couple of years back, like in 2017 or so, but we've now heard of things like white fragility and so on. And so I think it can be which phrase took, you know, people took in and said, yeah, that makes more sense to me. But yeah, white comfort, we're gonna start to talk a little bit more about it. So that's good background information for us. We would love for all of our panelists to come back. and we'll enter our third session. All right, great. See everybody back. So, you know, there's a wonderful recent article by Kurt Streeter of the New York Times. You all may have seen it. It's titled Running While Black. It really reminds me, if you're, you know, I'm a Don Cheadle fan, and he had this show on Showtime, House of Lies, and he often started that show running in the city in New York, and he would do it with his hoodie on, with his headphones. And Streeter's article really gives you that feel. It's wonderful stories by people talking about running, and it's everything from the sound and the feel, you know, to where they're going and some of the experiences that they have had. My oldest son, who was sitting and listening early on, talked about just this morning going out for a run, seeing the police, and then monitoring his speed. Really thinking, you know, how fast do I want to run? And, you know, there is that idea that we're accepted for running fast, but only in particular, you know, context, right? We want to run fast on the track, but if you're running fast in a neighborhood, then that says something else, right? So there's something there. I want to start with, you know, really these questions that should take us a little bit forward thinking. So we often talk about what should we do. I want to start with saying, what does our society need to stop doing, right? How can we avoid some of these deaths? What can we stop doing? And thinking, you know, broadly. So why don't we start with, I'll go with Lois first. What do you think we should stop doing as a society to counteract these deaths?
Oh, it's just such a long list and such a sobering question. I think as a nation, we need to stop criminalizing Black and brown bodies. The aftermath of Breonna Taylor's death, the aftermath of Ahmaud Arbery's death, look at the new footage that keeps emerging. And one wants to ask, what's the point of this? This is not a comparison. So I think one of the things we need to stop doing is focusing on the stories that do not matter, and focus on the actions that take place and the kind of privilege and out of control white comfort that is driving that. So I think, you know, to think about what we need to stop doing, stop criminalizing Black and brown bodies, and start resituating white bodies in relation to the really difficult, complicated, graphic history of race relations in America.
Wow, great. All right, Lois, what should we stop doing?
What Lois just said, right? It's the perfect answer. I mean, the only thing I can say is, like, stop killing us, right? But I mean, she's correct, right? This idea that we for so long have criminalized the Black body. There's this 400-year history of seeing it as an outsider, as a criminal, and that's hard to reverse, right? But one way you could start is with the laws, like if we know stand your ground law, it seems more like a way to check Black folks. Or what's going on in Georgia, just allowing someone to stop you and actually getting away with murder for 2 months because there's a law in the books that even though it was applied wrong, that allows you to do that. So that's a great start. The other focus, this is about sports, is just to really use sports as a better way to really examine who we are, and just to examine what, you know, start using our stories to examine the inequalities in society, to get at those answers.
Great, thanks. Mirna, what should we stop doing?
I have a whole list, but I only read a couple of things. I'm sure you all have really long lists. You know, aside from murdering us with impunity, I think that what I need to see on a large level is for the performative wokeness to go away. I need you to actually do the work. I need you to in addition to reading, I need you to get some training. I know the question was, what should we not do? But that's a result of not being performatively woke, and really getting down and digging into the work and going to classes, with facilitators and learning the language and learning how to do the work. I have a Black Lives Matter flag right across from me. That is performative, because they are not doing the work in this community. I need you to also stop minimizing, delegitimizing, and dismissing my experiences, because there's the whole idea of gaslighting is real.
Wow, thank you. All right, Rashawn, what should we stop doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna try and play the cleanup hitter. I mean, ditto with everything that was just said. I mean, as it relates to laws, as it relates to criminalization, as it relates to the fact that people should just stop killing Black people. And there's a couple of stats that I think people should know. First, when it comes to policing, Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by the police when they're not attacking or when they don't have a weapon. Who provides that information? Police provide that information. So we really have to understand the statistic there, right? And so Gregory McMichael in the Ahmaud situation, the fact that he was a former police officer, the fact that he was a former investigator for the prosecutor's office, what we see is how the blue wall of silence extends from police departments to prosecutors' offices to courtrooms. And what we really have to do is stop allowing our silence to become our acceptance. And here I'm specifically talking to people who view themselves as white allies. Oftentimes these questions come from white people who want to know what to do. They're aiming to be sympathetic and empathetic, and they want to know how to move forward. I mean, in addition to what Lois was saying about laws, which is something we could talk about from a policy standpoint, I've been trying to do a lot of that work at Brookings. But when it comes to what people can do in their everyday lives, people's silence has to stop being their acceptance. My grandfather, who served 21 years in the military, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, he taught me that growing up. And part of what that means is shifting ourselves from being allies to being advocates. When you're an ally, you can be reactive, you can be silent, you can put on a pen and support some particular issue. But when things hit the fan and you're sitting at a table where people are not sitting at, we need for you to be an advocate. That means to speak up and speak out for people who are not present or who are not able to do so. And it's one thing we know from Shirley Chisholm is that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu and someone's eating you for lunch. And if you're not able to bring a folding chair, we need people who are sitting at those tables every single day to speak up for us. Similar to how I think that sexism is a problem that men really have to deal with, racism is a problem that white people really have to deal with. Now, of course, all of us have a role to play, particularly when it comes to laws and other sort of things. But as Lois was saying, we cannot outclass racism. And so part of putting this all together, after we think about things from a legal standpoint, after we think about things from a policy standpoint, if people want to know what to do in their everyday lives, don't let your husband or your wife or your son or your mother or your father talk about Black people in a particular way that criminalizes us. You need to check that and speak up and speak out instead of accepting that as is.
Fantastic. So we're going to wrap up with this final question, and I'm going to just ask you to give two things, right? So athletes have been important in helping this ball to move forward. Of course, they have the platform. You have athletes there in Atlanta that started to push. You've got LeBron and others who make statements. And we've had the Maya Moores as well make these personal sacrifices to bring attention to, social justice concerns, criminal justice reform. So what are two things that athletes can do to help us? Lois, we'll start with you again.
Well, I think the mentorship is important. I think the public example, the breaking down of walls and barriers is absolutely essential. And when we see our athlete activists, our athlete advocates, and moving into what Rashawn just mentioned, moving out of athlete allydom into athlete advocacy is absolutely critical. So I think as a whole, that's one key thing. I think it's also really important for athletes to continue to connect the dots between the ways in which they are constrained by the system of white supremacy, patriarchy as well, the ways in which management, implementation, response to athletes is also informed by race, racism, and is exclusionary. So really thinking about athletes as fully engaged, vigilant, and outspoken commentators on the world in which we live and that we're trying to survive.
Great. Lois.
Yeah, so you asked for two things. I'll say one, don't stop. Too often when we look at the history of athletes getting involved, there's always these huge gaps, and almost felt like up until this moment, there was going to be another kind of post Trayvon, post Black Lives Matters gap, and hopefully this doesn't happen. So just continue, and so society can be comfortable and get used to athletes speaking out at every turn, right? Because they have these platforms. And the other one is don't be like Mike. And I'll just stop right there.
Yeah, shots fired. Okay.
Shots fired.
Mirna, what do you think? What can you and you might think about this in particular with your running community, right?
Yeah, I to the National Geographic when I was 2018 National Geographic Adventure of the Year, that I felt my job was to continue sticking into places where people didn't think I belonged. And that's the way I live my life. And I encourage other people to, we're already experts in white discomfort and how to deal with it. So let's keep doing it. And then the second thing is I need white athletes to stand up and stand out on the regular.
Okay. Rashawn, take us home.
Yeah, I mean, I think first is to continue to highlight these issues. Their platforms matter. If we look at the Ahmaud Arbery situation as well as what happened in Louisville, both of those situations were all about public pressure. Public pressure matters. And some of the research I've done shows the power of social media in this moment, in this movement for Black lives that we continue to be in. So public pressure from our athletes matters. The second thing is funding. Fund researchers, fund nonprofits who are doing this work, fund legal agencies that are doing the work and the change we want to see. And of course, we have some examples of that, obviously. I mean, even with the NFL and the NBA, we know that there are these things sort of going on. But really identify researchers who can provide the information and the research so that the laws that we're talking about can actually be changed, because the policies is a large part of what we actually have to change. As Lois was talking about, these citizens arrest laws and the fact that Georgia doesn't have hate crime laws, we can change those things. We have to change those things through research and funding, and athletes can help with that.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. You know, and I want to bring Kendall back as we start to wrap this up. I really appreciate all of you all's thoughtful responses. I know I was educated today, and I imagine others were. My family was here, and again, they were clapping and, you know, finger snapping, and, you know, these were things that echoed to them in different ways.
Sorry,
definitely something
I didn't quite catch that. Could you please repeat it?
Yeah, don't worry about it. We know that they're always listening.
They always listen. They always listening to us. My phone does that all the time. You say some words, they just know they're tracking us.
So we really appreciate having you all with us today. We want to make some final announcements. Kendall?
Thank you all. That was incredible. And it's hard to fit all of this, obviously, into 1 hour. So this conversation will continue. So we hope to have you all back either all together or definitely continuing the conversation. So thank you so much to our panelists. And before I dismiss panelists and Scott Brooks, of course, who led the wonderful discussion today, I ask our panelists, if you do have, I see Dr. Ray has already dropped something into the chat. If you have any last plug, something that you want to drop in there, please do. Again, we'll capture this for our audience in the recap as well. And if you are done plugging, please do dismiss yourself as attendees. If you want to just hang on for a second, we're going to drop our next show and the URL to register for that. Again, this is an ongoing series that we are hosting on a weekly basis, the Global Sport Matters live shows covering around the globe issues that are impacting the world of sport. So next Friday on the 29th, we will be hosting great experts to talk about COVID-19 and sport in Latin America. Of course, this is definitely not just sport. This is the intersection of sport, culture, you know, what this means personally, what this means to our community, what are those implications now that we are living in this new normal. So we will definitely drop the link for the next show in there. And additionally, we do have podcasts on our Global Sport Matters page, and we will reshare in the chat our URL for Global Sport Matters as well. So again, thank you so much to our panelists. Feel free, you are dismissed. Thank you again for such an incredible conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.